A good day to my 8th grade students. I'm going to begin with a question which was raised by one of the students yesterday, which I'd like to elaborate on. The question was, why would I say that Herzl was a bad person, or the early Zionists in general were bad people? They were not religious, but they were not necessarily bad, which is a very good observation. And bad, from our perspective today, we certainly would not call them bad, because they didn't know better. They were not religious. They were raised religious. They were tinoka shenizbu, we call it today children who were raised in captivity. That's what, actually, you should write that down. You should write that down. That's an important phrase. I'm going to spell it as on the index card. Tinokos shenizbu. Tinokos shenizbu means children who were taken to captivity as very young and never heard about Judaism because they were raised among non-Jews. So we today would consider all non-Orthodox, non-religious Jews to be Tinokos Shenishbu because they weren't raised, for the most part, properly. And even if they were raised Orthodox, very often they went off the derech. It's because of various different other factors which made their education deficient or inappropriate, and therefore they too are Tinokos Shenishbu. But back then, the concept did not exist, and especially in Eastern Europe. I was speaking last night after the question was raised by a student to my chavrusa. My chavrusa is of Hungarian ancestry. And he said to me when we were discussing the question, he said it's an excellent question. And we, especially those of us who are American or second generation American, or some of us even third generation American, or we come from different backgrounds, perhaps in Western Europe, cannot understand the depth of animosity between Jews and non-Jews in Eastern Europe, specifically in Southern Eastern Europe, but all over Eastern Europe, because the people there were persecuted day in, day out by the non-Jews in the surroundings. And in fact, my chavrusa told me his father was a Holocaust survivor. The day that the Nazis came into his town in Hungary, it was not the Nazis who were the greatest torturers of the Jews, but rather the local Hungarians. And he said that his father was once hiding in Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. He was there under fake papers, and he saw the Hungarians, together with the Nazis, arrest a Jew. And the Hungarians kept on beating him up and beating him up and beating him up, till the Nazis said, enough. He suffered enough. And to save him from his suffering, this is not exactly what we are considering saving, but to save him from his suffering, the Nazi shot the Jew between the eyes. So at least he would be dead, not being tortured. But the local Hungarians had this visceral, meaning extremely emotional. Visceral is a good word for you to know. It's an extremely emotional reaction without any immediate thought going into it. Visceral. That's a V at the beginning. Visceral. So they had a visceral reaction to the visceral hatred of the Jews, and therefore the Jews in turn had a visceral detestation of the non-Jews. There was such friction, which we in America can't even fathom today. So he said, any non-religious Jew who came from Western Europe, regardless of the reasons why they might be assimilated and why they might not know about Judaism or might not practice Judaism, the Jews of Eastern Europe, many of them immediately associated that person with non-Jews, because they were goyish. So since they were goyish, therefore they had the same attitude towards them as goyim. And therefore, they looked at them as being very bad people. Today, we would not look at it that way. But because of their association in their minds between the non-Jews who were persecuting them day and night and this assimilated Jew who seemed to be conducting himself similarly to the non-Jews, there was this visceral reaction of, this is something bad, these are people who are bad, we cannot trust them, and we certainly do not want to cooperate with them. Now, getting back to where we were yesterday, we were talking about the difference between the Agudah and the Mizrachi, but first I want to share with you a clip from John Green, short clip, in which he makes clear this point that there is no relationship between necessarily Zionism and Judaism. It's a nationalistic movement. And a nationalistic movement means that the focus is on the nationality and nationhood as opposed to the religion. So I'll put in the clip here, and then we'll come back afterwards.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war. Yeah, big ask, Mr. Green. I mean, that fight goes back thousands and thousands of years. Except thousands of years ago, there wasn't an Islam yet, so yeah, no. Also, let me submit that very little of this conflict between Israel and Palestine over the last several decades has been about, like, theological differences between fast during Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It's about land. Portraying the conflict as eternal or as religious makes it feel intractable in a way that, frankly, it isn't. So instead, let's begin, as most historians do, in the late 19th century. And instead of talking about religion, let's follow the lead of historians like James Gelvin and discuss competing nationalisms. Okay, so in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled over what we now know as Palestine. The population there, according to Ottoman records from 1878, was 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 3% Jewish. Everybody spoke Arabic as the daily language, and in Jerusalem, the religious populations were roughly equal. To give you a sense of life in Ottoman Palestine, an Arab Orthodox Christian musician named Wasif Jaharia grew up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, learning the Quran in school and celebrating both Passover and Eid with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Ottoman Palestine was, in short, a place in which people of different religious faiths lived peacefully together. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The late 19th century was the golden age of nationalism in Europe, and no place was crazier than the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which at least 10 different nations all wanted their own state. And in that hyper-nationalistic empire lived a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who had hoped that Jews could assimilate into European nations, but soon became convinced that the Jewish people needed to leave Europe and settle in their own state. The concept of Jewish nationalism came to be known as Zionism. It's important to keep in mind that most Zionists were secular Jews, so they imagined Israel as a state for Jews more than a Jewish state. In 1917, the British government, hoping to gain the support of Jewish people, issued the Balfour Declaration, promising, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. A bold promise considering that Palestine was still technically Ottoman, as they hadn't yet lost World War I. Of course, they would soon, but it turned out that the British were over-promisers when it came to Palestine, because a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British had secretly promised the French that they would divide up the Arab territories and the Brits would keep Palestine. Furthermore, in 1915, other British officials had promised the ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, that he would rule over an Arab state, including Palestine, if he led an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, which Hussein promptly did. So basically, the Brits had promised Palestine to the Meccans, to themselves, and to the Zionists. What could go wrong? Thanks, Thought Bubble. So shortly after the end of the war, the British established a colony in Palestine with the idea that they'd rule until the Palestinians were ready to govern themselves. At which point the people living in Palestine were like, well, now seems good, and the British were like, yeah, but maybe not just yet. Meanwhile, the British established separate institutions for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, making it difficult for Palestinian Christians and Muslims to cooperate, and easier for the British to, quote, divide and rule the inhabitants of Palestine. Again.
Okay, so now you've seen the clip, so now you know that, again, to reinforce what we say about nationalism, the point which is made in the clip, which I did not make yesterday, is the association of Herzl, not just with Dreyfus, which I think is the main association, but the association that John Green makes between Dreyfus, between Austro-Hungarian nationalistic movements, which ultimately led to World War I, and the idea of nationalism as it pertained to the Jews and the Jews as a nationality. Again, as yesterday, I'm not telling you what to write down so much. I'm telling you just you're supposed to write notes and be comprehensive. And most of you have the idea down pat. And some of you went lifnim Yeshua Sadin. It's not necessary, even though I appreciate it when you do that. But if you consult with each other, you will know if you got a lower grade, ask somebody who got a higher grade, and they will be able to show you exactly what we mean by comprehensive notes. I should note that if anybody ever wants to contact me, please feel free to contact me. And my phone number is 845-216-1617, 845-216-1617. Okay, so getting back to the Agudah and Mizrachi. So we said yesterday that the Mizrachi associated and cooperated with the Zionist movement. And this was something which obviously made them controversial in other circles. So the Mizrachi, as we said, came to be called, and this you should write down for sure, religious nationalists. Dati Le'umi. Let us write that down as well for you to write down and know about. Dati Le'umi. Religious nationalist. Dati is religious, Le'umi is nationalist. So they became known as Datiim Le'umiyim. And the Agudah was the cooperation between Western and Eastern European Jews in starting an organization which would be an alternative to Agudah and represent, to the Mizrachi and to the Zionist movement, of course, and focus on the national existence of the Jews as a Torah nation, as opposed to a religion which combined religion and nationalism. And the focus of the Agudah Yisrael was to represent the Torah nation to the world as a nation based only on the principles of Torah. And it really was, at the beginning, the brainchild of the Hirschian movement, in that it was very much a natural outgrowth and result of Torah Derech Eretz. The notion that Torah should be supreme, and Torah is the only value which we have on our banner, not additional banners such as secular nationalism. And the Agudah was midst of being formed when World War I broke out, and therefore only really became big after World War I was over. In fact, Rav Kook, who was the Rav in Yafo at the time, was on his way to a founding conference of the Agudah Yisrael, which was supposed to take place in 1914, when the war broke out, and he was stuck therefore in England in Europe in general, in England, Switzerland, and England for the next 4 years until the war was over. So the idea of Agudah was much more enhanced after the war was over. But this separated the religious Judaism into two major camps: the religious Zionists, the Datiim Le'umim, and the Agudas Yisrael members, sometimes called the Agudistin. Now there was a third. We mentioned way back when that there was a movement called the Neolog movement in Hungary and other Southern European, Eastern European nations. And the Neolog movement was similar to the conservative movement, somewhat frummer than what we consider conservative today, more observant of halacha, but nevertheless not fully observant of halacha, and not fully observant of the standards of Shabbos, etc., which we expect. And the Hungarian Orthodox were therefore very, very suspicious of anything which was similar to the Neologan. Again, in America, we could easily differentiate between conservative and Orthodox. But back then, the lines between the Neologan and the Orthodox were not so clear. They were kind of blurry. And therefore, the Hungarians and Romanians and Slovakian, all that southern European area of Eastern Europe, all became very suspicious of the Mizrachi and the Agudah. They didn't like either of them. They certainly didn't like the Zionists as well, because the Zionists even further removed. There was a famous Rebbe who was the Mizrachi Rebbe, who was mostly active after the war. But he once gave a speech in which he made a famous statement, or infamous, depending on your perspective. And it says, the Gemara in Gittin says that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed akamtso bar kamtso, because of the famous fight between at the banquet where the person was the host wanted to invite Kamtso, and instead Bar Kamtso was invited. Kamtso was his friend, Bar Kamtso was his enemy, and there ensued a tremendous public shaming of the Bar Kamtso, and eventually that led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So it says, Akamtso Bar Kamtso Nechra Beis HaMikdash. Kamtso is spelled like this, Kuf Mem Tzadik Aleph. So the way the Mizrachi Rebbe explained that, it's going to write out first. He said, Kamsus is a Rashi Tevis. It stands for Kommunistin, the communists. They were Jewish communists after the war. Took them at some other point, the Bundistin. They were called as well. It was the Jewish communists who helped support the new Soviet regime. The Mizrachistim, who we discussed. The Zionistim, who we've discussed. The Agudistim, who we've discussed. So they didn't like any of these. Communists, Mizrachnikim, Zionists, and Agudists. In Hungary, they were all not accepted. And Hungary and those southern Eastern European nations ultimately never joined together with the other Orthodox communities. And this is an issue to this very day in the Agudah Haredis in Yerushalayim, which used to be mostly non-Hasidic Ashkenaz, but eventually became mostly Hungarian Hasidic groups. And they, to this day, for example, will not refuse to adhere, at least publicly, to the limitations put on to the self-distancing limitations put out by the Israeli government, because they will not recognize the Israeli government. So therefore, whenever the Israeli policemen come to enforce the social distancing, they come out en masse to protest without any social distancing whatsoever. So there is still this divide till today between the people who more or less cooperate and the people who don't cooperate at all. In this, I'd like you to consider, again, a thought question. And it's only, I realize we don't yet necessarily have enough information. But where do you fit on the scale? Are you more of a religious Zionist, a Dati Lumi, more of an Agudist, or perhaps more of a Hungarian separatist altogether? And this leads me to the final point I wanted to make for today, which is the question which I asked yesterday about, can bad people or irreligious people lead to a positive outcome? That is the big issue of difference between these movements. The religious Zionists hold yes, for sure it can happen, and it did happen through the Zionist movement, even if they did not intend for it to be something which was Ratzon Hashem, clearly is Ratzon Hashem. The Hungarian separatists say no. Hashem would not act through people who are not tzaddikim and shleimim, and therefore this whole thing is suspicious, if not downright bad. And Agudistim are somewhere in the middle. They're a little bit, they are hesitant and kind of adopted at that time a wait-and-see attitude to see what developed, and for the most part they're still waiting and seeing, as modern Israeli politics would indicate. But this is now an issue which has been going on for almost 100 years. So I look forward to seeing what you write in terms of notes and in terms of where you think you personally would stand on these issues. Have a good day.